Democracy has always been the goal of the West for the entire planet, but upon closer inspection, we see that the West controls every democratic leader. All of the rulers in Africa, where there have been recent coups, stood for democracy, yet they were all puppets of the West. These presidents show little concern for their own people, acting and speaking in ways that serve the interests of the West. However, this changed, and in an attempt to save what's left of their nations, the military commanders staged coups. Propaganda from the West is being used once more to claim that these coups are not democratic. They now have a justification for interfering and intervening. He exposed how African leaders were blackmailed during a speech he gave at the UN General Assembly, embarrassing the Western leaders seated there. The head of Guinea's military revealed what the West intended to do next, and Africa needed to know. What then is it? Let's investigate and learn what he stated. He claimed that this is the result of decades of suppression by France in these African nations, even after their feigned independence. Rather than addressing the reasons behind the coups, he focused on what the West is currently doing in reaction to them. He stated that nations where coups have been observed have been condemned by the West and are subject to sanctions. But the West needs to understand that coups are a reaction to its policies regarding Africa. They installed African rulers who were essentially pawns of the West, becoming their new colonies in those nations. He stated that rather than viewing this delicate position as hostile, it is important to understand the underlying causes of these coups. The commander emphasized that people who use armed insurrection to topple a government were not the only ones who planned coups. Instead, these coups are a reaction to the part played by those who use sly schemes, deceitful methods, secretive plots, and constitutional manipulation to hold on to power. He was speaking, of course, of the African leaders and chiefs of state who have long consented to be the pawns of the West. They extend their control and provide benefits to former colonial powers by using the Constitution as they see right. According to Guinea's military chief, these people frequently hold white-collar jobs and act as democratic preachers. But in truth, it is they who are betraying their nations. According to him, coups are inevitable when this kind of immoral and undemocratic behavior becomes the norm. Back then, no political power had the bravery or resources to save their nation from total anarchy and insurrection, but the military chief pledged his personal commitment to keeping it that way. The puppet presidents only give a damn about what's best for the West when they are in power, because that's how their wealth will grow. Their wealth increases in Western countries when they sign legislation and bills that provide economic benefits to Western firms. But by doing all of that, they continue to keep their own nation impoverished. People's living standards drastically decline, and the nation is without any institutions to maintain unity. He made the point that the September 5, 2021, institutional reforms were considered as a direct response to the unstable circumstances that had ripped apart their country's social fabric and undermined societal peace. All the other coup leaders in African countries are doing the same thing, since he kept his country from collapsing while he was in charge. He supported the ongoing coups in Africa without saying it out loud. The reason for this is that there is no other way to prevent chaos and extreme poverty from occurring in those nations. Democracy finds a method to place the president who is most loyal to them, not his own people, therefore only the West will benefit from it if it is allowed to continue. As a result, the coup leaders are assuming accountability because the West has no power or ability to influence them. The coup leaders are being censured in the West because of this. He asserted that authorities in the West need to be aware of the social and cultural divide that exists between them and Africans. Why isn't democracy bringing prosperity to Africa if it is thriving in the West? This suggests that either society has changed or there are obstacles preventing the democratic model from being fully implemented. The head of Guinea's military stressed that Africans have woken up and are more determined than ever to take charge of their own future. He made the point that the stark differences in income distribution have created massive inequality, which has resulted in widespread starvation and extreme poverty. The population now faces greater challenges in their daily lives as a result of these conditions. These disparities are thought to be one of the main contributors to incidents endangering the peaceful coexistence of the area. Specifically, the accumulation of a country's riches within the hands of a few number of people, while infants in hospitals endure neglect and suffering. The scarcity of incubators has been a major factor in bringing about big changes in society. The majority of wealthy people are patronized by the West. They support the Western-selected presidential candidates in exchange. However, this will not go on like this. Military commanders can make drastic changes without the support of anyone, rendering the West helpless in their domestic affairs. The military chief emphasized that an imposed governance paradigm is what Africa is struggling with. Although this model has shown to be successful in the West, there have been significant obstacles in adapting it to African customs and the local environment. Realizing that they would be called hawks, destroying democracy, or soldiers trying to establish tyranny. The head of the armed forces stated that the democratic paradigm that was thrust upon them, especially following the Label Summit in France, has not worked. He made it clear that this recognition is an honest appraisal of the situation, based on decades of chaotic experimenting with this paradigm in the African environment, not a rejection of democracy per se. During this time, competent resource management and economic growth were frequently subordinated to political gamesmanship. From their brief but intense experience running Guinea, the military chief realized how much this model had contributed to the system of resource theft and exploitation by outside parties. It had also enabled widespread corruption among national leaders, some of whom were labeled as democratic for their readiness to give away the wealth and assets of their people, or abide by the advice and requirements of strong nations. You see, the West never complains when African leaders act in a way that benefits the West, regardless of how undemocratic and unlawful this behavior may be. However, when they witness a coup that is, in reality, against them and in the people's favor, they make every effort to paint military leaders as despots, saying that people who claim democracy, openness, and denounce corruption and bad governance are exposing the West. Were, in fact, subtly pressuring agreements to be made that would transfer their country's wealth through unethical and one-sided treaties. However, he wasn't only criticizing the West. Why didn't African leaders expose the West when they were in power, if the West was exerting pressure on them? They made the decision to serve as the West's pawns, permitting pillage and robbery in exchange for personal wealth. He acknowledged that some leaders have given in to different kinds of pressures, frailties, political goals, or secret objectives. However, the head of the armed forces did not support these acts. You should so comprehend why the coup leaders in Africa are despised by the West. They refuse to allow the West and its corporations to pillage and steal from them, not because they pose a threat to democracy. Do you believe the West would have loved Burkina Faso's military leader if he had told French companies to get out of the gold mines? He posed a straightforward query. Who can be faithful to the people of Africa, its own military commanders, or the powerful West that pillaged it? A pause resulted from this. The solution was known to all. He went on to say that the world at large ought to honor the solemn oath that the military leaders had sworn. For more videos about Black history, culture, civilization, and identity, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now let's go on. ECOWAS had, before, threatened to intervene in the African nations where coups were conducted if their civilian leaders were not restored to power. At this point, Guinea's top military official said that ECOWAS was first founded primarily for commercial gain. Therefore, it should promote communication over political entanglements and avoid consenting to look silly. The military chief expressed recognition of the tiredness felt by Africans who fiercely refused to accept the labels the West had placed on them. The younger generation in Africa, unsullied by the Cold War and previous ideological disputes, objected to being forced into the orbit of competing world powers. The general underlined that Africans did neither support or oppose any one nation. They were steadfastly committed to Africa. They saw the impact of outside influence on a continent inhabited by more than 1.3 billion people and saw it as a sign of prejudice and disdain. The military chief declared in a speech to the UN General Assembly that the days of old Africa were clearly over. Africa aspires to self-govern, with a population of over 1 billion people, of whom about 70% are young. He asserted that no one or the West is necessary to dictate to Africa how things ought to be done. The head of the armed forces demanded that African rights and their legitimate position on the international scene be upheld. They underlined how urgent it is to put an end to the condescending behavior that frequently treated Africans like toddlers. Africa, he claimed, had matured to the point where it could set its own priorities and develop models that reflected their identities as well as the day-to-day conditions of their countries and populations. He insisted that a new and careful examination of Africa be undertaken by the international community. It is imperative that they participate in authentic cooperation with Africa, cultivating an atmosphere of reciprocal advantage. Regardless of what the Republic of Guinea's military chief stated, the country's past contains its issues. Guinea was ruled by a number of different powers throughout centuries, all of which were regrettably foreign. Once upon a time, the region that is now Guinea was on the outskirts of major West African empires. The Ghana Empire is believed to have been the first of these. It grew wealthy through trade but finally shrank and fell under the power of the Almoravids. The Soso Kingdom, which filled the void left by the fall of the Ghana Empire, enjoyed a brief era of prosperity in the 12th and 13th centuries. But in the semi-historical Battle of Karina, fought about 1235, Sundiata Keita overthrew Soso ruler Sumanguru Kante, ushering in the rise of the Islamic Mandinka Mali Empire. The Songhai Empire was the most affluent of these successor states. Beginning in 1460, it grew in power and finally surpassed the Mali Empire in terms of both riches and territory. But once Askia Dawood died in 1582, a civil war over succession erupted, causing internal conflict inside the empire. The empire was weakened by this unrest, and only 3 years later, at the Battle of Tundabi, it was overthrown by Moroccan invaders. Even when the empire was conquered by the Moroccans, efficient government proved to be elusive, and it broke up into multiple minor kingdoms. The Arab slave trade flourished throughout the region, including the Gulf of Guinea beginning in the 13th century. When Portugal built commercial ports in Guinea in the 15th century, this commerce saw a major upsurge in activity. The buying, selling, and kidnapping of captives as part of the Atlantic slave trade all revolved around these sites. After then, other European countries engaged in this trade, which continued until the middle of the 19th century. In what is now modern-day Guinea, a number of kingdoms arose after the main West African empires declined. The beginning of French colonial rule in Guinea dates back to the early to mid-19th century, when France overthrew Portugal as the region's dominant power. By building forts, seizing coastal towns, and progressively extending their authority interior, the French were able to seize control. Guinea was first governed as a component of the Senegalese colony. It was afterwards incorporated into the Senegalese colony in 1882. In 1891, the colony of French Guinea was founded when the colony of Rivière du Sud was formed. The French victory over Samori Touré's army in 1898 cemented France's dominance in the area, granting France authority over the present-day Guinea and its surroundings. With the support of the French people, the Fifth Republic was established in 1958 as a result of political unrest and difficulties in overseeing its colonies under the Fourth Republic. Charles de Gaulle, the President of France, gave the colonies a clear choice on August 8, 1958. They could either vote for quick independence on September 28, 1958, or they could choose more autonomy inside a new French community. The Democratic Party of Guinea, led by Ahmed Sékou Touré, garnered an overwhelming majority of votes in favor of instant independence, whereas many other French colonies opted for greater autonomy. France withdrew quickly, seriously damaging equipment and infrastructure in the process. Guinea proclaimed itself an independent nation on October 2, 1958, and Sékou Touré was elected president. Guinea was unaware that under French administration, it was abandoned and that no autonomous institutions had been set up to run the nation. Guinea thus became the People's Revolutionary Republic of Guinea and adopted a socialist philosophy under Sékou Touré's direction. Touré advocated for Pan-Africanism abroad and African socialism internally. Guinea nationalized land at this time, ousted traditional and French-appointed chiefs from office, and broke relations with French businesses and the government. Economic swings were caused by its foreign policy, which alternated between supporting the Soviet Union and, by the late 1970s, the United States. Operation Green Sea, a 1970 invasion of Guinea, was carried out by Portuguese forces with assistance from opposition groups in exile in Guinea. Capture or axing Sékou Touré was the goal, because of his endorsement of the PAG, a Portuguese Guinean guerrilla group. Following several days of fierce combat, Portuguese soldiers withdrew without accomplishing the majority of their goals. March 26, 1984, saw the passing of Sékou Touré after a difficult procedure in the United States. Until fresh elections could be held, interim presidential duties were performed by Prime Minister Louis Lansana Bevogui. As per the Constitution, the PDG was supposed to nominate a new leader on April 3, 1984, and that person was chosen. Would have been the only person running for the presidency. Colonels Lansana Conté and Diarra Traoré, on the other hand, conducted a peaceful coup a few hours prior to the meeting, establishing Conté as president and Traoré as prime minister until December. Reforms were started under Conté's rule, such as the release of political prisoners and the encouragement of exiles to return. In addition, he announced a move away from socialism, even though the nation made little headway toward democracy and poverty persisted. Following his announcement in 1992 of returning to civilian rule, Conté held presidential elections in 1993 and parliamentary elections in 1995, winning a majority of seats for his Party of Unity and Progress. But Conté remained firmly in control, and opposition leader Alpha Condé was jailed in 2001 on charges of jeopardizing state security before being released from prison 8 months later. When the presidential elections were held in October 2020, President Alpha Condé emerged victorious. Condé, who has been in office since 2010, overcame significant opposition when he decided to run for re-election a third time. There had been accusations of vote fraud. Despite a 2-term restriction, the president contended that a constitutional referendum held in March 2020 had given him permission to run for office once more. Nationwide, violent protests broke out in the wake of the election. The military toppled Alpha Condé on September 5, 2021, which was a major shift in Guinea's political climate. The nation was taken over by Mamadi Doumbouya's National Committee of Reconciliation and Development. Guinea's leadership was further reshaped on October 1, 2021, when Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, the mastermind of the coup the previous month, took office as the country's acting president. The border plan, which is finally taking shape, included the ascent to power of Guinea's military chief. The most recent move toward achieving complete autonomy and sovereignty for Africa is the coups in Niger and Gabon. There is no denying that the world is changing radically. The post-World War II international system is progressively becoming smaller, as is the Pax Americana that supported it. This offers African nations a chance to rethink their place in the global arena. They are seeking alliances with newly and re-emerging powers by turning more and more of their attention eastward. The West should totally disassociate itself from their actions, and anything they decide to do should be their choice. African countries have long been unhappy with the current international framework. Because of their history as colonists under several European countries, they came into this system as rule takers. It is completely understandable that they are uncomfortable with the political, economic, and cultural influences of the West, as well as with the idea of double standards and conditional support. Africa is in a good position to co-create international standards because it has 55 member states in the UN, an abundance of natural resources, a young population, and great potential to become a worldwide economic powerhouse. Numerous African leaders are aware of how the world is changing, and that Western dominance is no longer unchallenged. They see this as a chance to form alliances with other nations that further their respective national interests, and exercise autonomous judgment when it comes to international affairs. African countries also need to begin formulating their own set of values, tenets, and regulations that serve them well in the context of the emerging global order. This calls for bold leadership at the national and continental levels, a break from development paradigms that date back to the colonial past, and more funding for coordinated continental action via an energized African Union. It's all happening right now. How do you feel? Should African leaders in the military and civil society allow the West to meddle? Is it not the case that the Western model of democracy, which was implemented for their own purposes, has failed in Africa? Tell us what you believe is best for Africa: the military commanders rescuing their country, or the civil leaders who frequently end up as pawns of the West? Would you like to see more videos similar to this one? Click the bell icon next to it and subscribe to our channel if the answer is yes. We have made the decision to present videos on a topic that is rarely discussed: Black history, culture, and civilization, as well as examples of how amazing Black people have always been. I appreciate you viewing, and be sure to tune in for the next one.